that we need to introduce the speaker of this conference, this panel, because all the news on the brochure and the conference document already. So the rule of the game is that each speakers can use maximum 12 minutes. So I will remind them when it comes to the 11 minutes. Sorry about that. And then we have more time for discussion, all right? So this section we divided by two parts. The first part is presentation, and then we have a coffee break. After that, we refresh our mind, and then we come to debate in another hour. So by order, I would like to invite Professor Brahma, Chancellor of India, to speak first.
To speak from here?
All right, it's up to you. Okay, right.
Well, thank you. I'm going to present the big picture in the world and then connect it with the implications for the South China Sea, as the title of the session suggests. The International Maritime Order is being fundamentally transformed by new technological and geopolitical realities. With tectonic power shifts underway, the international political order itself is in transition. Today, technological forces are playing a greater role in shaping international geopolitics than at any other time in history. Economically, the rapid pace of change in technology, transportation costs, and regulatory environment have acted as a spur to the rise of emerging and many other developing economies. The global shifts in relative economic weight are set to only accentuate and gradually reshape military equations. But unlike in past history, power shifts now are being brought about not by battlefield victories, but by a peaceful factor that is unique to our contemporary world: rapid economic growth, which in turn is changing maritime realities. Rapid economic growth is bringing about qualitative power shifts, even as the importance of military power remains intact. This suggests two things. One, the nature of power is changing, even if subtly. And two, power shifts now are part of an evolutionary process rather than a revolutionary process of the kind that we saw in the past, especially in 1945, 1919, 1815. In those years, as a consequence of a major bloody war between the great powers, revolutionary power shifts unfolded. Such revolutionary power shifts seem unlikely today. Even the International Maritime Order has entered an evolutionary phase, and we are unlikely to see any abrupt shifts in maritime power equations. Yet they are real threats to maritime peace and security. These threats are linked to several factors, including changing power equations, shifts in global trade and energy flow patterns, the rise of unconventional threats, and the sharpening competition over natural resources and over geopolitical influence. At the regional level, threats to maritime security range from ocean piracy to interstate disputes over maritime boundary, sovereignty, and jurisdiction. In the South China Sea, or the East Sea, as it is called in Vietnam, the biggest threat to maritime peace and security comes from revanchist policies on territorial and maritime issues. At the root of the current tensions in the region are attempts to unilaterally change territorial and maritime frontiers. Consequently, threats to navigation and maritime freedoms are increasing in the region. Let's be clear. Respect for existing land and sea frontiers, as well as respect for international norms, is a prerequisite for peace and stability in any region. As history attests, attempts to disturb the status quo tend to stir geopolitical tensions and conflict. Today, the South China Sea has become the symbolic center of the global maritime challenges of the 21st century. After all, nowhere in the world are the maritime challenges greater than in the South China Sea, a strategically crucial body of water through which $5 trillion worth of trade flows every year. The growing importance of sea lanes and maritime resources in this region, as well as the concentration of economic boom zones along the coast here, has made maritime peace and security more important than ever. However, sovereignty claims, naval buildups, resource-related competition, and increasing nationalism are contributing to the rise of maritime tensions. Consequently, threats to maritime freedoms and navigation are also increasing. One regional concern directly centers on sea lane security, given the South China Sea's critical importance for global trade and energy flows. Great power rivalries are also compounding maritime security issues. While the United States is seeking to hold on to its traditional advantage in the region, China is working to gain dominance in the region, an attempt that impinges on the interests of a number of regional and outside states. China, in fact, is actively working to challenge the old order in the South China Sea and beyond. This is in keeping with the greater maritime role it wishes to play. Determined to take the sea route to securing global power status, China is carving out a strategic role for itself, even in the Indian Ocean region. China's ambitions in the Indian Ocean region are reflected in its Maritime Silk Road initiative, its submarine forays into that region since last year, and its move to secure a naval base in distant Djibouti, which overlooks the strategic Bab el-Mandab Straits. Whether the Maritime Silk Road is just a benign-sounding new name for China's string of pearls strategy is an important question that cannot be dismissed. Put simply, the South China Sea is a region where old and new challenges converge. The old order coexists uneasily with the emerging new order. Against this background, developments in the South China Sea have the potential to affect the international order. After all, the South China Sea has emerged as the world's newest maritime hotspot. The specter looms of this region becoming a zone of intense geopolitical competition as important powers joust for access, influence, and relative advantage. In this region, a new great game is unfolding. Fueling this great game is the fact that 4 national strategies converge or intersect in the South China Sea, making it a hub of greater geopolitical competition. The 4 national strategies are America's so-called pivot to Asia, China's Maritime Silk Road, Japan's westward-facing approach, and India's Act East policy. Make no mistake, the South China Sea is likely to determine the wider geopolitics, maritime order, and balance of power in Asia and beyond. So outside states have an important stake in the developments in the South China Sea. Yet, even at the risk of handing China a fait accompli, the United States has restricted itself to lodging only diplomatic protests over China's frenzied land reclamation activities in the South China Sea. The Obama administration has been reluctant to carry out on a regular basis, I repeat, on a regular basis, freedom of navigation flyovers or sail-throughs within a 12 nautical mile zone of China's man-made islands or its enlarged islands. One symbolic sail-through, as happened recently, does not change the bigger picture. No less important is the fact that the Obama administration, preoccupied as it is with the Middle East, has not yet provided strategic heft to its pivot policy. In fact, there has been a course correction in the pivot policy, with the name itself, pivot, being dropped in favor of a new term, rebalancing, so as to tamp down the military aspects and lay emphasis on the economic elements. The recent turn of events in the global war on terror, following the Paris and Mali attacks, suggests that the United States is unlikely to shed its preoccupation with the Middle East anytime soon. This is good news for China, just as the Ukraine crisis earlier proved a geopolitical windfall for Beijing. To conclude, developments in the South China Sea ought to be seen in the context of the systemic shift in the global distribution of power. The ongoing great game in the South China Sea is pivotal to determining the direction of Asian security and shaping the global maritime order. The threats to navigation and maritime freedoms in the South China Sea can be countered only through adherence to agreed rules among all parties and through monitoring. For that to happen, this region and the wider Asia need to have a stable balance of power, a balance of power that offers an incentive to all important players to build rules-based cooperation and competition. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. I would like to invite next speakers, Captain Sukjoon Yoon from Korea. Yeah, floor is yours.
You mean I'm going to podium over there? Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Sukjoon Yoon from Korea Institute for Maritime Strategy. The original topic given by the organization was the change of the balance of power in the region and the world, and its impact on the South China Sea. And then after that, I have just one question, whether the region really have a beautiful application of European-based or style, the balance of power. properly or politically and legally. I couldn't see any certain indications we have a European-style balance of power. First, I can't see any certain intentions from two great powers, such as China and United States. The region has been too much contaminated. There are severe competitions, conflict, and disagreement, and even distrust. Second, there is some huge discrepancies between what the two great powers wanted to do, as we observed in region South China Sea issues, and what the regional nations want them to do to establish peaceful solutions. So these big discrepancies between two entities provide the regional countries intractable problems. So what am I supposed to do? For that, I have a more pessimistic view than optimistic view. First of all, why I'm so pessimistic for we have balance of power in the region. There are three reasons. First, the concept of the modern nation state has swallowed root in the Indo-Asia Pacific region. Second, there is a widespread and fundamental prejudices and distrust among the parties and states. And the most importantly, the region has been disrupted by their competitions and conflict in terms of geopolitical power politics. Is that all I have for my papers? At the same time, I also have a more optimistic view on that. Why should I do this? There are three reasons. First, despite the military pursuing between China and the United States, fortunately, there is no appetite to serious military confrontations. Second, the regional states, when not being intimidated by either of the great powers, make it clear that they are eager to discover a less volatile and more practical manners of preserving peace and stability in the very sensitive, disputed waters. And crucially, no countries want to see the extensive regional trade and economic relations damaged by chaotic and unpredictable crises in the disputed waters. So these two pessimistic and optimistic views requires something new players in the region in order to maintain either current state quo or new state quo, which is one of great powers wanted to make in the region. Then what are the best options for us? From my personal point of view, is the concept of a middle power cooperation. I mean, with the nations of the region facing the strategic dilemma, which I mentioned earlier, it is in the two great powers' own interest to include the regional nations in discussing how to significantly rethink its strategic contribution with the great power politics. There is good evidence of some movement in these directions. For example, from the multilateral summit in this month in one of the countries of ASEAN, including middle powers such as India, South Korea, Japan, Australia, and members of ASEAN. Significantly, there is also a more general process on the way in which middle powers are adopting their strategic profile through multilateral cooperation in bodies such as ARF, ADMM+, APEC, EAS, etc., which are beginning to get involved in some South China Sea issues. So, what I would like in my paper, awareness of potential role of middle power is rising throughout the region. With powerful economies making significant defense contributions and provide a growing their active constructive role in regional power structures and the security dynamics. These middle power presence are much more capable partners and allies for their great powers than ever before, especially when they cooperate in a coalition. And any balance of power undertaking by the great power needed to acknowledge this reality. Simply continuing with great power games is a strategy that will serve no one effectively, neither United States nor China. For the regional middle powers, the great power games are continuously disrupt, constantly produce new threats and unpredictable challenges. But the dynamic instability which results presents an opportunity for the middle power to cooperate. And this makes it clear and easier to reveal the great powers' infamous purposes and clarify their ambiguous actions. By combining the considerable capabilities of several nation-states, and by taking a balance of power stance between the great powers, the middle powers can surely oblige more attention to be given to their purposes and interests than is currently the case. So, ladies and gentlemen, this is my bottom line. We are entering in a new era in which the middle powers can no longer to be disregarded. The combination of great power strategic autonomy and more powerful individual capabilities with redefine the strategic environment of the Indo-Asia Pacific. And yet, the two great middle powers shared many interests with the middle powers who also wanted to see the rule of law upheld and the continued economic development. So, however, it is beloved as merging power or declining power, when the two great powers rethink its approach toward the Indo-Asia Pacific region, they needed to get over these obsessions with great power games and acknowledge the role of middle powers. A dynamic framework is required to deal with the dynamic region. Due to time constraint, I got to stop here. Thank you for your attention.
Yeah, thank you, Captain. You have 1 more minute, right? So I would like to invite next speakers, Dr. Shen Dingli, right, from Fudan University of China.
My great honor to be invited. This session, we are going to address the change of the global landscape and possibly its impact on South China Sea area. I would offer my personal take. One, globally, America is rising. From the year 2000 to this year, US GDP rises 70%. Defense spending rise 100%. US is rising. Second, China is also rising to the second place in the world. China's GDP rises from $1 trillion in the year 2000 to 10.4 trillion US dollar last year, almost 900% rise. Defense spending from 15 billion US dollar the year 2000 to this year, 145 billion US dollar to what the government has officially stated. That's almost 900% rise. China is still small comparing with the US, but China rises 10 times as fast as America. This creates an impact. Some impact that America and many other countries like. China imports 2 trillion US dollar equivalents of foreign goods a year, second only to the US. No one hates China's importation. Second, last year China has 107 million people traveling abroad, and lots of countries welcome Chinese people to visit. America offers 10-year B1, B2 visa. Canada competes with America. And UK is going to offer 6 months visa. And Vietnam reduced visa fee to charge to Chinese from today. China became very popular, not to mention China's investment in America. We are going to possibly invest for a fast rail, probably America's fastest rail from Los Angeles to Las Vegas. We are going to invest in United Kingdom for nuclear power reactor. But there are other impacts that other countries may not want to have. Obviously, the theme of this conference, the issue concerning South China Sea. A number of countries, my good friend Brahma Chellaney has mentioned, the renewed, heated dispute over island sovereignty. I would add the competition over economic resource in the overlapped area between the non-dash line and China's neighbors EEZ area. And the heated phenomenon of China's very fast infrastructure buildup in South China Sea. If this would be viewed as one belt, one road, others may have some question. I personally sympathize. If I am not a Chinese, I probably would develop a similar concern. Why China is doing all this all of a sudden, so fast, so much? Is China willing to abide by its earlier commitment of peaceful rise? But then, if we take a close look, what is hotspot, hotness? 3. One is the hot dispute of island sovereignty, especially within China's non-dash line and within others' EEZ. And the second, is China qualified to do fishing business in others' EEZ? And the third, why China is suddenly building up such a impressive artificial island? Would China cut sea lane of communication at the time of its need, at the future time, when it competes with America or others? All legitimate question. We should not avoid to discuss. We should discuss all this whenever we meet people. If we have good argument, we should present our argument to array others' concern and to bring peace to all of us. So I tried to do this work. 1. The 1982 UNCLOS indeed entitles all littoral country to have at least 200 nautical miles if that would not collide with its maritime neighbors' similar quest. But that does not give sovereignty to island in others' EEZ if they were not entitled to others before 1982. UNCLOS only gives exclusive economic rights, not sovereign rights, but economic rights. And China claimed as early as later 1940 that China is entitled to all this island. China may be wrong, but others need to defend. We present our evidence to Pan Ki-moon, UN Secretary General. Why one of our good neighbors may have not argued against early enough. That gives China reason that their later occupation of this island, when they initially to admit in a certain way that this belongs to China, creates disputes. Sure, Dr. Chellaney mentioned that we should respect the status quo. But our friend used not to respect the status quo. But that may not give us the good reason that we should repeat the wrongdoing against them, as Confucius mentioned. When you don't like others to do something against you, you should not learn to use the same thing against others. But at least that does not give our friend an argument that we do not deserve a dispute. So we have dispute, legitimate dispute. China has exercised its restraint not to threat to use force to settle dispute. Secretary of State Ashton Carter mentioned at the Shangri-La dialogue in Singapore this year. I was there. He mentioned that over time, Vietnam has acquired 48 outposts in the region. Malaysia 5 and Philippines 8. But China built all of a sudden 7. China's problem is that China is doing later. China did not start, but China has been doing very fast. If China is wrong, everybody has to stop. So US has threatened to send its USS to seize close water of Malaysia, Vietnam, and the Philippines to tell China US is fair. We appreciate America, to be fair. If no one can do, everybody stop to destroy. If somebody can do, then China's phenomenon of doing too fast may not be a problem. The problem can be a future, that if China would use this capability for unwarranted, unlegal, per international law purposes. So over time, China has suggested, let's have one-on-one talk to settle dispute. You take this island, we take few, but our friend refuse. But if we are entitled to some of this island, certainly we are entitled to some sovereign water or economic water which overlaps with our friends EEZ. When China took a holistic approach that we deserve entire water for fishery and all rocks, this creates a problem. But when others took holistic approach that China does not deserve any island and economic rights within their EEZ, these two holistic approach collide. And China has such a collision with Vietnam, with Philippines and Malaysia, and each is different. Each has similar nature, but each feature is different. So we suggest that let's have one-on-one talk, mutual concession. You take some, I take some, you take most, I take less. And I may not be entitled to the economic rights of the entirety of the overlapped water. But our friend refused. So China now is building up, and our friend is upset. I deplore for all these developments. Our friend took a holistic view. And I also, personally, I'm not satisfied with Chinese holistic approach. I hope we have room to talk, first bilaterally, to understand our problem and to take a mutual concession. And secondly, because of such a division has a similar nature among these stakeholders, we may also have multilateral approach to address the problem as well.
1 more minute.
1 minute.
Yeah.
And the third, when Deng Xiaoping made his speech in 1974 at the United Nations conference, promising we did not seek hegemony in the past, and now, and in the future. And in the future, China seeks hegemony. I want to point out that the US does seek hegemony because US naval strategy has a point at the time of need to cut all 14 critical sea lanes of communication, and does not also US as a space strategy at the time of need not to allow anyone else to enter deeper space. China so far does not have such a strategy. China may have in the future, but Deng Xiaoping said, if China would seek hegemony in the future, please be united against China. So I welcome our friend, be united if we seek hegemony. We build given current situation. And I personally sympathize with our friend. Let's honor President Xi Jinping's commitment. We would not militarize this artificial place. But we do have some limited need for defense need. Let's meet, discuss, bring peace back to South China Sea, or what Vietnam would call East Sea. Thank you very much.
Thank you, professors. We have next speakers, Professor Odgaard. The floor is yours.
Thank you, and thank you for inviting me to speak at this conference. I will talk about China's maritime strategy, and I will compare it to the United States. In the booklet, it says that I'll speak about the South and East China Sea, but since this is a South China Sea conference, I'll try to focus on that, although I think there are some similarities between the two areas. If we look at China and the US in the Asia Pacific, I would call them both conditional revisionists, with a term borrowed from Thomas Christensen. He only characterized China as a conditional revisionist, but I guess I would characterize both the US and China as such. What does that mean? Thank you. That means that both powers try to revise the current status quo in a way that better suits their interests. In my view, the US is not only trying to preserve the alliance system and its position of primacy in the region, it's also trying to revise and update the alliance system so that it's prepared for a region where it sees China as its main strategic opponent. And that means upgrading the alliance system with new strategic partners, making some allies more important, giving them a role in areas in a way that they didn't have before. For example, Japan is gradually having or taking a new and more significant role security-wise, and that has been encouraged by the United States. It's now also exercising in the South China Sea, something which we haven't seen before. Vietnam has begun military cooperation with the United States. So there are revisions to the way the US alliance system, which means that I would characterize it as revisionist. Likewise, I think China can be characterized as a revisionist in the sense that China is attempting to push back at the US alliance system in all major sectors, economic, political, militarily. It is of the opinion that the US is too dominant in its home region and that a greater space should be carved out for China. That doesn't mean that China is trying to throw out the United States of the region, because I think China realizes that's not an option, but for the time being, but at least China is trying to have a position of greater strength and influence alongside the United States. And that does mean that China is strengthening its military position. It's creating new fora for influence, such as the One Belt, One Road, the AIIB Bank, and other initiatives to counter US initiatives. Conditional revisionist means that given that they're both revisionist powers, what can be done to maintain a greater level of stability? Well, it means that both powers can be persuaded to hold back a little if the other side convinces its opponent that they're not going to bother the other's core strategic interests. So in order to have greater stability, the US and China would both have to convince each other that they're not going to try to undermine and ruin core interests of the other side. However, that doesn't happen at the moment, which is why I think we see increasing levels of tension, and I think the South China Sea is an arena for those growing tensions. I'll look at three different areas where I think China's and the United States fundamental interests clash, and which explains why it's so difficult for them to lower tension levels, even if none of them have an interest in a more confrontational situation. One of them, which I'm sure other speakers will deal with at greater length, is the legal area. And I think here the situation is that there is a number of legal gray zones which makes the two powers manifest what they see as the correct interpretation of international conduct, and that ends up ratcheting up tension levels. If we first look at China, China has, they're trying to walk on two legs in this area. On the one hand, China has stepped up its reference lately, I would say, to a historical claim. So Chinese leaders have lately clarified that in their opinion, they have sovereign rights in the South China Sea, which goes back to ancient times, and they're not willing to give up on those claims. However, China is aware that that kind of interpretation has met wide criticism internationally and is probably not going to gain much support from international law in the way that the majority interprets it. So China is at the same time, and has done for decades, pursuing a policy of effective control, which you can argue is more along the lines of what most countries would consider a legitimate basis for international law. At the same time, there are a number of gray zones, which means that both the China and the United States compete for sort of what is the right interpretation. And this goes particularly with regard to military activities within maritime zones. Not only China, but a number of other countries, especially developing countries, have started to question which kind of military activities you can perform within various zones. And also there is a debate on how you define a particular military activity. So for example, what constitutes innocent passage, as we saw with the USS Lassen incident. There isn't agreement on that, at least not between China and the US, and therefore it becomes contested, and they each try to manifest what they see as the correct interpretation. The good news here is, as was said by earlier speakers, that none of the powers are at all interested in a military confrontation over these issues. So even though they have these disagreements, they take pains to avoid a confrontation. So the USS Lassen incident was known more than a week before it actually happened by the Chinese. So it was very orchestrated and very planned. What happened and what the response was. On the other hand, this is core issues for both of them. For the United States, this is about the U.S. The U.S. alliance system and the rules that sort of underpins that alliance system, and that is one reason that it's very important for them to manifest that they have a particular interpretation of the freedom of navigation, of innocent passage, of these principles that they consider to be key national interests. On the other hand, for China, this is not just about sovereignty, it's also about, as I said, pushing back the US alliance system and showing skepticism of some of the rules that underpin it, which is to the advantage of China. So here, their sort of interests clash, and one of the areas where that comes to the fore is in the area of international law. There are also blurred strategic lines between the two. If we look at China's policy, on the one hand, China says that it advocates peace and stability, and it doesn't intend to militarize. But on the other hand, China reacts very forcefully to challenges to its territorial and maritime zone claims, saying that it's not willing to give up an inch. The problem here is that it's not entirely clear what China's claim is. There is the 9-dash line, as most of us probably know, but it doesn't really constitute an official claim. So it's not clear for others what it means that China is not willing to give up an inch and to react to challenges. So seen from the perspective from other powers, it's at China's will, and when they see it as advantageous to China to respond, but it's unpredictable for other powers when this actually takes place. And that creates a lot of insecurity among the neighboring states and also on the US part as to when will China respond and what will the response be. That is not clear because the whole basis of China's presence and the objectives, they're sort of another gray zone. The US, on the other hand, says that it prioritizes freedom of navigation based on international law, and it claims to always be in line with international law, although it hasn't actually signed the Law of the Sea, which is one of the relevant conventions here. And on the other hand, the US does move in those legal gray zone areas. It flies and sails near features whose legal status is not always entirely clear. And therefore, while claiming to always be in line with international law, the US is clearly also moving into areas where it seems that there is no agreement on what is the right interpretation.
You have one more minute.
Yeah.
I'm sorry about that.
I'll move on. Thereby, it sort of questions its own claim to be in the right always. Finally, the two have different interpretations of deterrence. So China includes in its interpretation the option of using compellence against other states' offensive behavior. But this offensive behavior doesn't have to include the use of force. It can be that a state, for example, occupies a reef and constructs on it, and China sees that as a challenge to its sovereignty and then feels entitled to use force to counter that behavior. That is not in line with the deterrence definition of the United States and the West, and so China comes to be seen as aggressive in a way that it didn't necessarily intend it. The US, on the other hand, accuses China of having or militarizing the area, but at the same time, the United States has quite a substantial forward military presence that it uses to manifest that international waters cannot be treated as within the jurisdiction of another state. That is quite a massive presence, and China has lately questioned why does the US criticize China for militarizing the area when the US is sort of the main military power in this area. So also here, the two powers clash in their view of what deterrence is, and that can create a dangerous situation as well. Given this situation, what can be done? Well, if the powers really wanted to lower tension, they would have to assure the other party that they're not going to bother their key interests. That would mean for China to stop from using compellence with law enforcement capabilities in disputed areas. So China would need to stop responding with force to what it sees as provocations from other powers if they have not used force. Also, you know, it's claimed not to challenge freedom of navigation without changing the state of play is not always correct. Sometimes China does change the state of play, for example, by the land reclamation efforts and the construction on the islands. And China needs to recognize that it's not only part of a sovereignty game with regional powers, but it's also part of a strategic game with the United States. So even if the Philippines and Vietnam did land reclamation before China, for the United States, it does change the state of play because the game is another one, which is about the rules underpinning the alliance system. And that needs to be taken into account before China decides what to do. The US, on the other hand, I would argue to lower tension would need to refrain from operating in these legal gray zones to demonstrate commitment to universally approved interpretation of international law and to leave it to other fora such as the arbitration panel that's set down instead of trying to actively affect what's the correct interpretation in its actions. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Professor. Yeah, our last speaker is Dr. Nam Duong from DIB. Nam Duong's floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Among the important factors that can have a deep impact on conflict management in the South China Sea is the evolving regional maritime security architecture. Well, in comparisons with other factors, I believe that the regional maritime security architecture is quite quiet, is more quiet, and, but it is no less impactful to conflict management in the South China Sea. Over the past few years, we have witnessed modest but also important developments in the regional maritime security architecture. And the latest development would be witnessed in the recent summits in Kuala Lumpur and even in APEC meeting in Manila a few weeks ago. So this latest development can be very complex. It can have complex impacts on conflict management in the sea. But in my opinion, I would see the more positive impact and provide more opportunity for conflict management there. So I'm of the view that the evolving regional maritime architecture can provide a window of opportunity for conflict management, especially with regard to the maintenance of peace, stability, as well as creating a favorable environment for the DOC and COC process. It can support the DOC and COC process. At the same time, it can complement this process so that we have an inclusive and comprehensive overall management of conflicts in the sea. And ASEAN should work with dialogue partners in order to strengthen the architecture and for the sustainable management of the sea. So let me start with the evolving regional maritime security architecture first. This year, there are many game changers in the South China Sea. 2015 is an important year. And the new normal, the status quo, new status quo in the spread list. The United States' active involvement in the sea. And now I believe that the United States is part of the conflict, although it is not a claimant, but is now part of the conflict. And one, we get the involvement of the United States in the process, then it is quite difficult, it is quite hard to kick it out of the process. Also, the PCA's recent ruling in favor of jurisdiction, and Japan is becoming a normal country, and possible involvement in the South China Sea conflict. So, on this development, we have implication for the role of regional institutions. Normally, in the time of major power confrontation, major power tensions, then it is a good investment if we place our resources in regional institutions. Well, up to now, the sole avenue for conflict management here is often thought to be the DOC and COC process. Over the past recent meetings, I believe that there have been modest progress in terms of consultation and negotiation on the COC. Despite the modest progress, so I think the COC hasn't yet entered into a period of substantive discussion. Well, I think the COC will be delayed, at least at the moment. There haven't been any substantial progress with regard to the COC. So if we take into calculation the latest development in the South China Sea, I believe that is the last chance for the COC this year or next year. So 2016 is a critical year for the COC. Because I'm not very overly optimistic about it, because in 1 year we have only several meetings, the JEWG as well as the SOM, ASEAN-China SOM on DOC-COC process. So in 1 year, it is hard to make substantial progress. So I believe that unless the COC can address and have agreement on substantive issues such as geographical area, practical cooperation, preventive diplomacy measures, and then the COC will be fed away in comparison with not commensurate to the latest development. So beyond the DOC and COC process, we have the overarching regional security, regional maritime security architecture, and ASEAN will be at the center. And we have ASEAN-related institutions, ASEAN Regional Forum, the ADMM Plus, East Asian Summit. Within ASEAN, we have the ASEAN Maritime Forum and also the expanded ASEAN Maritime Forum. And ASEAN has produced substantive results such as the Declaration on Search and Rescues of Peoples and Vessels in Distress at Sea. With regard to the ASEAN Regional Forum, then the ARF has established a working group, a work plan on maritime security. And I think the work plan has been progressing for about 5 years. And it is approaching the second stage of development, that is preventive diplomacy. So when we have preventive diplomacy in the ASEAN Regional Forum, that can contribute quite positively to the DOC and COC process. Of course, we have to, clarify the division of labor as well as the coordination between ASEAN Regional Forum and the DOC and COC process. Also, we have the ADMM Plus. With the ADMM Plus has already established an expert group on maritime security a few years ago. Unfortunately, at the most latest development in Kuala Lumpur, then the ADMM Plus meeting has failed to produce a statement, reportedly because of the US-China disagreement on conflict management in the South China Sea. So it is a mixed message. Also, the East Asian Summit. The East Asian Summit, normally every year we have a meeting and they produce a German statement. And in the German statement, we have one or few paragraphs on EAS viewpoints on the South China Sea. And yesterday's meeting has ended, but the news release from Kuala Lumpur is quite tight. So I haven't seen the German statement at this moment. And the only document that I see on the internet is the EAS statement on counterterrorism. So I believe that because at the threshold of the East Asian Summit, terrorism has become a big threat. So the South China Sea dispute has been a little bit overshadowed by counterterrorism. But it is still a dominant topic for discussion in the East Asian Summit and in other ASEAN meetings. 2 weeks ago in Manila, then the APEC summit haven't produced in the final statement any mention of the South China Sea, which I believe that it is just because of the threat of terrorism, as well as the Chinese pressure on excluding the South China issues from the final documents, and also from the official agenda of the APEC meetings. So that is the regional institutions. There is other initiatives that building a new one, an overall architecture for maritime cooperation. For example, the Japan's Institute for International Policy Study, the IIPS, in Tokyo, they have come up with an initiative on the AMOSC, the Asian Maritime Organization for Security and Cooperation. So this Track 2 initiative is to build an overall and single organization that covering maritime cooperation in the entire area. But up to now, there haven't any positive responses from Track 2 as well as from Track 1. I think one of the reasons is that an overall single overarching, single institutions can be instrumental, can be detrimental to the principle of ASEAN centrality. So that may be one of the reasons why it hasn't got, a positive response from, many various around the region. So at least there has been existing so many instruments for maritime security cooperation in the region. So apart from the DOC and COC process. So this is the big picture. Actually, we have more than the DOC and the COC. So our EC now is to link, the DOC and COC with the regional maritime security architecture, so that the DOC and COC can be supported. And the principle, the legal principle of the DOC, COC, as well as the overall architecture is the UNCLOS, the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. So all these institutions agree on a legal principle, on UNCLOS. So that can serve as the legal basis, very solid legal basis for the regional maritime architecture. So, so the implication of this, on the conflict management in the South China Sea is that, as I mentioned, it will be a window of opportunity. Mostly positive impact, but it is complex, so I can see the positive impact out there. And it can provide for inclusive and comprehensive, environment in which, other efforts at, conflict management can be operated. It's a pluralist platform. And also, it is needed to promote the shared principles of maritime conduct as well as international law, especially UNCLOS. And the overall architecture is quite conducive, favorable to confidence building and preventive diplomacy, COC and other instruments. So it can also, enhance the awareness of the maritime domain in Southeast Asia and also in the Asia Pacific, and can, promote practical cooperation and enhance awareness as well as capacity on, practical cooperation, and to further promote, confidence building and preventive diplomacy. So let me have a few words about the role of ASEAN. The architecture has been evolving, and there are so many regions, so many visions, as well as national interests of the ASEAN member states, as well as the dialogue partners of ASEAN in shaping, the regional architecture. So because there's so many competing visions of the evolving regional architecture, I believe that ASEAN's, the role of ASEAN, should be, emphasized. And the ASEAN approach to institution building, I don't think that there is an alternative to ASEAN centrality at the moment. So, the view of ASEAN is to support a multi-layered and comprehensive, inclusive regional institutions for maritime security cooperation. So ASEAN should strengthen its centrality and to work with dialogue partners in order to maintain, a concert of power surrounding ASEAN and, work as a political as well as strategic basis for the regional maritime architecture. And ASEAN should also invest more in the East Asian Summit, because I believe that this is an inclusive forum. And it is, although the East Asian Summit is less developed, underdeveloped at this moment, but it is very promising. In that, it includes all the participation of the major powers. And the major power, all those ASEAN centrality can take the lead, but the major power always play a very substantial role in conflict management in the sea. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you, Nam Duong. So we finished all the presentation, and we have about 10 minutes ahead of the schedule. I would like to propose that we have a coffee break now, and then we come back at 10 to 11 sharp. So please enjoy your coffee break. Yeah. It's clear. Okay. So I think that we go by round. Each round we take about 4 or 5 questions. Yes. And the second part, we also encourage the panelists to cross-fire with each other. All right.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Carl Thayer at the University of New South Wales at the Australian Defence Force Academy. I have 3 quick, very brief questions. To Professor Chellaney, you made a distinction between pivot and balance. I actually thought it was more a rhetorical flourish than it was substantive. The main U.S. policy in March 2011 has always been rebalance, and I'd like you to comment on that. Second, Dr. Dingli, repeatedly throughout your presentation, you referred to islands. And if we take the international definition of islands, I'd like to know what islands does China actually occupy in the South China Sea that are naturally formed, can support human habitation, have an economic function. And finally, Dr. Odgaard, I thought your focus was too narrow. The United States alliance system is much broader than seeing China as an adversary. And your presentation didn't mention the extensive US attempts to engage with China, including over 100 mechanisms, including many, many military mechanisms. And besides, the ANZUS alliance between the United States and Australia was aimed at Japan. Is it revisionist when the alliance no longer saw Japan as the enemy? Alliances evolve. They respond to capabilities and technologies, particularly if countries aren't transparent, and they deal with non-traditional threats. And I thought yours was a bit too narrowly focused and missed the broader thrust of the American presence in the Pacific. So you could comment on it. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Carl. The gentleman over there. Yeah, right here, you.
Thank you. I'm Michael Gao from Taiwan, National Taiwan Ocean University. I have a question for the panelists. Because we have heard about the sending of battleship by the U.S. of Larson's into the waters surrounding so-called low tide elevations in the South China Sea. I'm just wondering that since the U.S. has showing its support for the Filipino judicial settlement with China, and submission 4 and 6 of the Philippines in this litigation concerns the legal status of 5 maritime features which are considered by the Philippines as low tide elevations. But now the award on jurisdiction was recently released by the tribunal, and the tribunal says that it has jurisdiction over 7 submissions, including those 2 submissions. So I'm just wondering, in this time, the legal status of those so-called low tide elevations are still undecided and still pending. So I'm just wondering what's the legal basis for the U.S. to send battleships into the waters surrounding those so-called low tide elevations, pending the determinations of the tribunal, and while U.S. says it supports Philippines' judicial settlement. Thank you.
Thank you. Would you focus on the theme of our sections, that we say development in the world and its implication to South China Sea? If there are any question relating to the legal aspect, you can go to section 4. Okay? Right, thank you very much. I see Bill, please.
Bill Hayton. Today I'm Associate Fellow of Chatham House. My question is for Dr. Shen. I want to congratulate you on solving 50% of the South China Sea problem. What you seem to be saying is that China from now on will base its claims on islands and zones drawn from islands, entirely compatible with UNCLOS. So is this the end of the U-shaped line? And how much support does your proposal have among your colleagues and government in China?
Okay, thank you, Bill.
Well, my comment was based on the discussions that I had in Washington at that time. You know, when the pivot was actually unveiled, a feeling emerged in Washington that the US had come on rather too strongly in seeking to take on China, putting the US in an uncomfortable position of trying to contain a country with which it increasingly shares economic interdependence. So there was a debate that was going on in Washington. The result of that was that the term pivot was officially replaced with the term rebalancing in all government statements and documents. So that was the context in which I described the shunning of the original term and the adoption of a new term. The fact is that soon after the pivot policy was unveiled, the US began tamping down the military aspects of the so-called pivot and began emphasizing the economic elements, in particular the bilateral, multilateral economic partnerships, including the TPP, and pointing out that the pivot is not really about military counterpoint, but it's actually largely about creating an economic balance in the region. There was also a question about the U.S. Role and whether the U.S. is coming out in support of the Philippines. Well, you raise a legal issue in terms of maritime features, and as the chair said, that is an issue that needs to be debated in the two sessions that we have on international law. But I think a time when the United States could have actually supported the Philippines was in 2012, when China captured the Scarborough Shoal, which is located within the Philippines' exclusive economic zone. And the seizure of the Scarborough Shoal occurred despite a US brokered agreement under which both Philippine and Chinese vessels were to withdraw. The Philippine vessels withdrew. The Chinese gave the impression that they were withdrawing from the area only to reinforce their military positions in that area and to capture Scarborough Shoal. The Americans did nothing to come to the defense of the Philippines, despite a mutual defense treaty between the Philippines and the United States. And it sent a very chilling message to other countries, to other allies of the United States, in particular Japan, that a mutual defense treaty with Washington may not be sufficient for the security of an ally. And I think the Scarborough example not only set a bad precedent, it only emboldened China, as we know from subsequent events. So if the US were to come to the defense of the Philippines, it would have done a better job had it done so in 2012.
Professor Sayer raised the question, what island China occupied? When I use the generic term island, I should be more cautious. I was mentioning island, islets, reefs, or rock features. For island, Hainan Island is one of them. A question from professor from Taiwan mentioned, what about the USS Larsen entering the near water of Subi? I may have limited knowledge. My understanding is that the Subi is a low tide elevation, which means when the tide goes low, we can see the rockets. Then the UNCLOS entitled it to have territorial water. So US sent its ship to use the legal term innocent passage, not other legal term, freedom of navigation. That has caused the Senator John McCain to ask Pentagon to clarify. But so far, US used the term. To some, this means US acknowledges that China is entitled to the territorial water of this rock. Of course, US not stated clearly, and US can take a next wave of action to differentiate with its last action. We will see. I did not get the last question. Could you repeat?
Bill,
okay. So in your presentation, you were describing China's claim in terms of sovereignty over islands and maritime zones drawn from islands. So that would be entirely compatible with UNCLOS in a way that the U-shaped line is not compatible with UNCLOS. So my question is, was that your intention, that China is moving its claim to be more in line with UNCLOS, and how much support does that have in China?
Firstly, per UNCLOS, that international instrument give us a platform to divide the maritime interest, but not the sovereignty. When there is a pre-existing dispute over sovereignty, UNCLOS does not handle it. That's my view. I hope my government has the same view. But as I mentioned at the beginning, I offer my personal take. I have not consulted with my government and any other colleagues from mainland. I only consult with the treaty, with the law. But at the same time, as a personal note, I would also inform you and others. I publish front page signed commentary on People's Daily overseas edition once a week. So when those were approved to be printed, that was official line.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Shen, Dingli. Again, I propose that you focus on the theme of this section. So all other questions relating to legal aspect, you can pass to Dr. Nong Hong in section 4. Nong Hong is a legal expert here. He's on UNCLOS, right? So I see over there.
Can I answer my question?
Oh, okay, sorry. Right.
Thank you. So thank you for your comment, Professor Taylor. I guess I tried to focus on the issues that create problems in the China-US relationship, so I didn't mean to be overly negative, and I agree that this relationship is also characterized by a lot of meetings. Indeed, I think the two militaries meet every day, the China and the US. I don't think they're enemies in a sort of way where they hate each other. So I see the relationship as fairly pragmatic. I also think they're both very concerned to avoid military confrontation, which is why, for example, the US will not in public, but unofficially at least notify China of what it's doing well in advance, so China can carefully think how to respond. However, it does, in my opinion, happen in a context where the two are strategic opponents. To me, they're also both revisionist, and in the sense that none of them are revolutionary, so I don't think any of them try to, overthrow the existing order and create a new one. But I do think they're making serious adjustments. So the United States suggests the TPP. It does update and revise the alliance system in a way that for China presents it with new challenges, creates new roles for some of the allies, and includes new strategic partners. China does the same, so they don't reject the system. So the One Belt, One Road is still based on market economic principles, but of a Chinese variety, if you like. So it does look for investments, building of infrastructure based on market economy. So I would say, you could argue that they're both trying to revise the existing structures. And in that respect, they are opponents because they don't favor the same structures. And at the moment, we're in a situation of competitiveness where they haven't really, to a sufficient extent, coordinated their initiatives so as to reassure others that, they can have permanent conflict resolution mechanisms and manage this differences of interest in a way that sustains stability, in a way that's a natural process, I guess, and not to be overly worried about. But, the fact that China does demand more influence in the region does create some ripples and instability that I don't think they have dealt sufficiently with yet. Thank you.
Can you finish?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. Oh, sorry about that, right. Yeah, later on we see the gentleman over there. Đấy. Anh Hùng hay anh Ca nhỉ? Có ai dựng cái đấy? India, all right. Okay.
Thank you, the Chairman. I used to be Ambassador of Vietnam to Singapore and Canada, and now I work for the Foundation for East Sea Studies. I would like to make a couple of comments and have a question to all the speakers of the first section. On my view, the South China Sea is a small piece of the whole strategic picture in Asian Pacific, which is rooted in the regional and global power shifts. It is reflected in the accommodated rise of China and the ongoing negotiation of a new regional order between China and the United States. In the context of the escalating South China Sea land reclamation efforts, the United States and the regional states are faced with a series of unappealing options: action or inaction, unilateral or multilateral. So, what is vital for peace and stability in the South China Sea is that all concerned parties should base their strategies and policies on worst-case scenarios. Naturally, both China and the United States need to consider how their actions may lead to unintended consequences, especially unintended escalation towards military conflict. So therefore, the major, the middle, and the small countries in the region need to adopt a strategy that focuses on long-term objectives. So may I seek further observations from all the speakers based on your creative thinking on possible remedies that may manage the tension on and off in the region, in the immediate, and the mere remedy that can be conducive to a peace and stability in the region in the future. I thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Ambassador. I see gentleman next. Buzinski? Okay, floor is yours.
Thank you. Leszek Bushinsky, my affiliation as given on the program is the National Security College, Australian National University. I have two very quick questions. First to Brahma Chellaney, because he referred to the American failure to come to the defense of the Philippines over the Scarborough Shoal incident of 2012. Yet the American side has repeatedly emphasized to the Philippines that the Mutual Defense Treaty of 1951 will not apply to Calayan, to the South China Sea, because they defined the territory of the Philippines as outlined, 1898 Treaty. The claim to Calayan, the South China Sea, came subsequently in 1971, thereabouts, 1978. So the situation is considerably more complicated than your comment suggests. Now, my second question is to Shen Dingli, because you referred to, and you used the word mutual concessions twice from memory. And I find it difficult to believe that China could consider mutual concessions in the situation of the South China Sea, given that China has repeatedly emphasized and adamantly stressed that sovereignty is indisputable. China has historical rights over the area. So how can you possibly consider the idea of mutual concessions? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Jack. So, Su Hao, okay.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Chairman. I'm Su Hao from China. Goes to. I have two questions. One goes to our Indian presenter, another will go into their Vietnamese presenters. Regarding professors, sorry, your name, Chellaney, right? Professor Chellaney, you're talking quite a lot about the tensive situation in the South China Sea. In particular,
will you turn off your microphone, Thuy?
In particular,
problem.
Oh, Chinese, Vietnamese,
China and Vietnam.
well, the close connection with each other. Yeah. Because China and Vietnam, we are good friends with each other. Yeah, so Professor Chellaney, you're talking quite a lot about the tensive situation in the South China Sea, and also the case regarding the Scarborough, issues. Actually, there's regarding the Chinese action in Scarborough behavior. This is something like the back and forth between China and the Philippines. In the past 30 years, sometimes China's there already 1970 and 1980. And then Philippines and now China, so this back and forth. But it seems as you suggested that because of Chinese behavior, so America is present in this region and back up the Philippines. So my question to you is that in your presentation, you're talking about the balance of power. So my question to you is that, do you think that the balance of power, it will be the efficient logic to define the regional, status quo over the South China Sea? That means United States present in the South China Sea could be the reasonable way for all the claimants to set up their balance of power structure over the South China Sea. Okay. And my question to is our Vietnamese friend, right? So, first you are talking about the presentation regarding the multilateral platform for the management of the South China Sea, in particular the recent events happens in Philippines. And so many ARF, ADMS, and ES. Yeah, that's true. I think this platform of the multilateral, way is also sort of, some kind of important, venue for the discussion. And also somehow, like you mentioned, as the DOC or in the future COC's, discussion. But just a few weeks ago, there's the ADMS Plus in Colombo. It seems that there's no joint declaration because something is unexpected. Behavior on this multilateral platform. So my question is, I was curious about your point that, yes, or many multilateral platform is much focused on the regional economic cooperation or regional security cooperation, but not there's some kind of sensitive security issues like the South China Sea. So do you think this current international multilateral platform is also the useful venue for the discussion about the South China Sea? Thank you.
There were a couple of questions addressed to me, and I'm going to offer remarks that cover not only those questions, but the broader issues. First, the main parties in the South China Sea, in terms of sovereignty claims, are not China and the United States. It's China and several smaller countries. The US comes into the picture in terms of the role it can play. in helping supporting the smaller states that are claimants to the various islands and territories. In the last 3 years, certain actions of the United States have raised concerns among these smaller states in the South China Sea as to what extent the US is willing to come to their support. And we have to acknowledge and appreciate the concerns of the smaller states in the South China Sea. They're concerned that China and the United States, as two big powers, are going to cut deals between themselves, leaving the interests of the smaller states in the lurch. And their concerns have been accentuated by at least 3 wake-up calls. The first wake-up call came in 2012 when the US kept silent over China's capture of Scarborough Shoal to say that the US-Philippines Mutual Defense Treaty, under that treaty, the Americans have said that South China Sea is not covered, is a technicality. It's like saying that, that the Americans have said that Senkaku Islands are covered by the US-Japan Security Treaty, but at the same time, the US also says that it does not take a position on the sovereignty issue relating to the Senkaku Islands. Where does that leave Japan? The issue is not the technicality. The issue is that there was a US brokered agreement under which the Philippine and the Chinese vessels were supposed to withdraw. That one party honored that deal, the other party did not. And yet, the Americans, despite a mutual defense treaty with Manila, kept quiet. Contrast that with the strident American reaction to the developments in Ukraine, including the annexation of Crimea. The fact is not what the treaty provides for or what the Americans have said in terms of clarification. The issue at stake was the fact that the status quo was disturbed. The second wake-up call came the following year in 2013 when China declared an air defense identification zone that covered territories it covets but does not control, setting a dangerous new precedent in international relations. The Obama administration had the option of postponing, not canceling, of postponing Vice President Joe Biden's scheduled visit to Beijing. It did not do so. In fact, it advised American airlines to respect China's ADIZ, thus contradicting Japan's advisory to its carriers to ignore the ADIZ. The third wake-up call came on the Ukraine issue. Under the Budapest Memorandum, the US had committed itself to uphold the territorial sovereignty of Ukraine in exchange for Ukraine surrendering its nuclear arsenal. But when it came to the crunch, the US said that the memorandum, Budapest Memorandum, was just a memorandum. It didn't mean much. So I think we have to put all these elements in the bigger picture to understand the concerns of the smaller states. Some of these concerns might be a bit bloated, yet the fact is that the smaller states are really concerned because they are dealing with an emerging power which is seeking a dominant role in South China Sea. And how the concerns of the smaller states can be addressed, how can the status quo be maintained, are very important issues that go beyond issues of international law. As the chair said, we will have 2 whole sessions on international law. In fact, the South China Sea maritime security challenges are compounded by the international law challenges. For example, how can international law help to settle disputes in the South China Sea when, as the South China Sea illustrates, power usually trumps international law. When might is right, what is the role of international law? And it's just not China. It's not just China that is trying to override international law. If you look at developments since the turn of the century, we made the transition from the 20th to the 21st century by breaching international law. The bombing of Serbia, the separation of Kosovo from Serbia, the invasions of Afghanistan and Iraq, and all the way the developments more recently, the overthrow of Muammar Gaddafi, renditions and torture of terror suspects. All these were flagrant breaches of international law. China is only taking a lesson out of the playbook of some of the other powers. And this is an unfortunate development which has important implications for the international order. The fact of the matter, and I'll make this last point, is that whatever happens in the South China Sea has a bearing on the larger international picture. In fact, South China Sea is critical to the larger contest for influence in the Indo-Pacific region. And this contest in turn is central to China's own intent to fashion a Sino-centric Asia. If China has its way in the South China Sea, it'll become more assertive in the Western Pacific and the Indian Ocean region.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor. I think that we should have one American scholar on this panel. Yeah, but we can return to this kind of discussion to section 3, major power interaction in South China Sea again. If anyone wants to know or discuss South China Sea. So I would like to
Mr. Bozinski has a question. How China would possibly conceive mutual concession? Let the facts speak. China always preach 互谅互济, mutual concession and mutual giving. Not unilateral. I give, you don't give. Mutual. It's recorded. You can write many PhD theses to find this ample evidence. And that has been supported by ample evidences. Not only mutual, but also unilateral, that many Chinese would be very unhappy. The Chinese government give land away without hearing at the National People's Congress, without national referendum, give land away. DPRK say the heavenly pond, Tianchi, is where their ancestor used to be born. So why is it at China's hand? So China, hearing this, China give half the pond away. Then they say, one more, another half. China say, no, no. My people will be very unhappy if they know the history. It's not mutual, it's just one way, unilateral. Also, I'm invited by my Vietnamese host. I give another evidence that would annoy my host. Republic of China used to draw 11 dash line. We lost 2 because we supported our older friend, North Vietnam, for its anti-American war. We sent 300,000 people, and we spent $20 billion US. And we were requested to lease an island. We did. We were not able to get it back because Vietnam said that island belonged to Vietnam from eternal time. Okay, you take. We delete 2 dash line to what I heard. My people will be very unhappy. Chinese living in Taiwan would be very unhappy. Who gave mainland Chinese leaders the right to abandon Chinese land? It's not mutual, it's one side. We suggest mutual for a long time. We think Diaoyu Island is ours. America mistakenly reverted this to Japan. It was under Americans' control from 1947 with the UN permit. But when the US reverted this to Japan, US skipped the UN. If China would be there, China would not accept such kind of decision. China would say, I disagree. US would still do unilaterally, but US would not respect China. Then China talked to Prime Minister Tanaka, it's mine. We don't send our people there. Taiwan sent, and Hong Kong sent. We did not send. We made a concession. And Prime Minister Tanaka not agreed in a written way, but agreed in a verbal way. Japan would not send. And the 2 countries committed this mutual concession for 41 years until 1913. Japan changed to nationalize. When Japan no longer make a concession, quote unquote, China is not in a position to adhere to its concession, quote unquote. China, Russia. Russia took a part of China after Communist Party took over power. Republic of China lost it, was not able to take it back. We are not able to take the full part back, but we took 50% back, 174 square kilometers a few years ago. Russia was very unhappy, but they made a compromise, concession. And we lost for good 50%. That the Republic of China in Taiwan may never be ready to accept. But at least we get 50% back peacefully. China-India, line of actual control. In the past, when Indian patrol would do their job, our patrol would follow. They would follow when we patrol, and the 2 patrol can collide because one side may step to a place when the other side thinks it's my side of the line of actual control. 2 years ago, border area defense cooperation agreement committed both sides not to trail each other's patrolling. It's a mutual concession. I have a right to follow, but I say I don't use. And you don't use the right you are entitled to have. I can write a thesis about all this China's theory and the practice of mutual concession. So there is don't feel surprised. Someday when China make a bilateral agreement with one of the other claimant to peacefully and happily settle their dispute, as both are willing to give, why ready to take?
Okay, so initially there was a question about how can we create stability given the situation, and just to be brief, I think that some reassurance from China, but also from the US towards each other that they're not going to damage each other's core interests are vital. So for China, I think the lack of clarity around China's claim combined with China's commitment to say that, they will not give up an inch and they will, if necessary, be willing to use force to defend their claims, is bound to create unpredictability and uncertainty, because that essentially means that people don't know, well, when is China going to respond, with what kind of means? And that's an unacceptable situation for most other powers, which encourages them to take on a worst case scenario. So it would be helpful if China was willing to recognize that they're not only part of a game about sovereignty with neighboring states, but they're also part of a strategic competition with the United States. And even if they feel, for example, that with land reclamation they just copy behavior of other smaller states, it just does have a different significance when China does this, because it is part of China's military buildup in the region, and it can and will be used for that purpose. And I think China has actually said that itself in public statements. But the lack of willingness to recognize that it's part of these two different games does ratchet up tensions. I also think it would be helpful if the US held back a little on its activities in legal gray zones and sort of waited for other fora to clarify some of the issues that aren't really clear at the moment, instead of performing or using its military to state what it sees as the correct interpretation. If the US refrained from that, it would have more credibility with all powers as to its claim to always be in line with international law. Thank you.
I just have one question directed to me from Professor Chu Hao about the usefulness of regional institutions. Well, I believe that by nature, regional institutions are insufficient, and nobody just rely on regional institutions to settle to the conflict. But anyway, hardly anybody can refute the usefulness as well as the convenience of these regional institutions in confidence building and providing a platform for at least for dialogue and for further cooperation. I think that the strong point of this regional institution lie in the fact that it provides inclusive forum to engage all the stakeholders, all users of the South China Sea, so that we can have an overall management of the conflict without excluding anybody. With regard to the current ADMM Plus meeting in Kuala Lumpur, well, you know that it fails to produce a statement. And I can't comment on why it fails to produce a statement, reportedly because of disagreement between the United States and China over maritime security in the South China Sea. So I believe that our Chinese and American colleagues can provide a better answer to the question as to why the ADMM Plus meeting in Kuala Lumpur failed to produce a statement. But I believe that it is disappointing because the ADMM Plus only meet once every 2 or 3 years. So the fact that it failed to produce a statement is by itself disappointing. But I also believe that it is quite normal. It is not the first time that a regional meeting failed to produce a communique. And it is quite normal that one regional group failed to produce a communique after being convened. So I think the question comes down to the fact that how should these institutions be useful, and what is the functions, and what is the legitimacy, what is the authority of these regional institutions. You know that all these institutions focus on the non-traditional aspect of maritime security cooperation, and it doesn't replace the DOC as well as the COC. Even the DOC and COC process do not touch upon the sovereignty issues. So how can regional institutions can touch upon sensitive sovereignty issues? They just focus on non-traditional aspect of maritime security cooperation. And I believe that they can strongly support the DOC process in the fact that they can provide all of these forums support, the negotiation and consultation on the DOC and COC process, so they can affect a kind of compliance with the COC once it is concluded between China and ASEAN countries. At the same time, it can show up other principles such as UNCLOS, as well as other principles of international regional conduct, maritime conduct, and I feel that the effectiveness of these institutions lie in the fact. Thank you.
I haven't any direct questions for my presentation. I only have one broad questions from the from the Vietnam about what is the vital things to resolve some distrust between two great powers. As I mentioned, we couldn't see any certain intentions of what they want to do. And then the more seriously, these two great powers haven't asked the regional nations, say, what do you need to do for our laws? They just think about their own strategic interest in these complicated and diverse regions. And with regarding to questions about what is the worst scenarios for this the region with regarding to crisis in the South China Sea, I think there are two feasible and possible scenarios. The first one, there would be something like a secret agreement between China and United States to resolve South China Sea issues. For example, they wanted to separate sovereignty issues and then legal issues. And the second thing is, these two great powers, such as China and United States, may sacrifice our intentions, which means regional nations' willingness to resolve these issues. So what I'm concerned about, in the short term, China and United States may have tacitly agreed something secret agreement on the South China Sea issue. We can see there's some certain indication the region what the China and United States did for their military confrontation. In the long term, United States may allow China to more active role in the South China Sea, because United States can do anything. They don't have any certain options to deter South China's assertiveness in the South China Sea, which in way is surrounding small and weak Chinese neighbors. Thank you.
We take one question from the first row, and then we give priority to second row, the third row, and people far behind this whole room. Division.
Thank you. My name is David Ross. I'm a consultant sites. I'm working in China. I have a question, actually, or questions and comments to all the speakers, or at least they touch on what all the speakers have said.
Captain Yoon has suggested that there's a bigger role for middle powers to play in managing traditional security in the region, but I didn't hear any actual practical suggestions. Would you suggest strengthening the role of the EAS in traditional security? Do you think middle powers should coordinate their positions in these multilateral fora? What is South Korea willing to do to help lead this effort? These are practical things that South Korea can. And I think the major powers would welcome a constructive role played by middle powers. And then with respect to how the U.S. has been characterized by the other speakers, I think, well, first, a small comment about what Professor Odgaard said about the U.S. Having not signed UNCLOS. The U.S. did sign it, the Senate has not ratified it for a minor technical reason in UNCLOS, but the U.S. does observe the principles and norms in UNCLOS. And the question is China. China has signed it, China has ratified it, but others are not convinced that China is actually implementing the principles and norms and respecting the institutions set up by UNCLOS. So I think creating some kind of equivalence between the U.S. and China in this regard is misleading. Secondly, the U.S. is in a position of trying to please everybody, and it ends up pleasing nobody. So, for example, Professor Chellaney is not happy that the U.S. has been rather timid, so to speak, or not as forceful as he would like in defending the status quo in the South China Sea. Professor Odgaard is suggesting that the U.S. is trying to change the status quo in the South China Sea somehow. And Professor Shen is saying the U.S. is meddling and stirring up trouble in the South China Sea by interfering too much and encouraging small powers to oppose China. I think all of these characterizations of the U.S. are inaccurate. That is to say, what the U.S. is trying to do is respond to the concerns of allies, respect China's rise, accommodate it constructively, and defend the status quo, but in a way that is not destabilizing, in a way that's responsible. And I think the U.S. is fully aware of the strategic significance of the South China Sea, the effect it's going to have on global history, but these matters have to be handled prudently and constructively. So I'll end my comments there.
Let's see. Chris?
Thank you. Christopher Roberts from UNSW at the Australian Defence Force Academy. Just re the so-called idea of containment. I just want to add that it's important to remember the US and the West have actually greatly enabled China in its growth and rise economically and therefore militarily over the decades. The US, if anything, has only sought to contain the risk of coercive action and conflict. The origins of this issue, from my perspective, do not start with China and the US. So in agreement with one of the panelists, it's between China and the smaller countries. In fact, it could be argued that Beijing's calculation is that the West, including the US, can't actually afford to do, and this ties in also with one of the panelists' comments, to do enough to change Beijing's calculus of costs and benefits in terms of its current strategy. In fact, I worry that in Beijing some may think they have already achieved a fait accompli with the island construction and what can be done. And perhaps that's a question to ask the panelists. What could be done collectively by the international community, ASEAN, individual states, etc., to change such an assessment if it does in fact exist? So I agree with Professor Brahma Chellaney about the Scarborough Shoal. I think in the broader context, this and many other actions, such as what you mentioned, the ADIS, etc., have demonstrated to the US that it has had to take a more active role, that it was reluctant. The early statements, and I followed the statements from the beginning of the Philippines raising the treaty obligations, the original statements were ones of almost embarrassment, saying that the treaty did not, as was mentioned, pertain or embrace rocks and shoals. But that position on the treaty has actually, and what it includes, has toughened over the years. And I would argue this is not at the initiation of the US, but by reaction of the US to Chinese actions and other things such as the 981 oil crisis. And of course this links to confidence in its treaty network, but this does not make it a revisionist country. when it comes to the regional order. With the occupied features, just a question for our Chinese panelists. I would like to know what the dates of occupation were. What features by other countries have been occupied since 1982 UNCLOS? I don't believe that we have really seen a change of the status quo by other countries since UNCLOS came into law. Just with regard, and finally, my last two questions and a final brief comment is under what circumstances will China clarify its limitations to its claims within the 9-dash line? I ask this because speaking to a head of a state-funded institute in Beijing, the statement was, we don't even care about the center of the South China Sea. We want what's in the exclusive economic zone of other countries. When I asked, but under international law, there is no basis for that claim, the response was, well, we're willing to share 50% of that. I said, but who would give you 50% when you have no claim to that unless there's an overlapping EEZ? So I just wonder how these perspectives or perceptions that we even see in Beijing can be ratified with or reconciled with broader concerns in the region and the idea that China wants to resolve the claims in the South China Sea peacefully. And just for the broader panel, what will it take, again, to change the current cost-benefits analysis that it seems Beijing has formed over its actions, including the island construction in the South China Sea? Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. Since we have only 8 minutes to the lunch, so I would like each panelist take about 2 minutes, okay?
Okay, I'll be brief. Thank you for the comments and for your interest in the talk. Sorry about my mistaken use of signing. I should have said ratified, so you're completely right on that. I do, however, think that it's going too far to say that the United States is always in line with international law, in particular in this region. I do think that the current state of affairs, and I'm sure we'll hear more about that later, is that there is a number of gray zones in international law where if you ask the lawyers, they are not able to provide a clear answer as to what are the right interpretation. As I said, one of the key areas is military activities within various maritime zones, and that does encourage states to perform what they see as the correct interpretation, because a lot of international law is down to practice, state practice over a period of time. However, I think in the current climate it would be beneficial for the US to stay out of these gray zones to sort of convince other people that they are indeed always in line with universal international legal principles, and where it's not clear what the law is, then we can await for lawyers to tell us how they see the current situation. I will maintain my argument that I think the US is revisionist in the sense that it doesn't, like China indeed, none of them try to overthrow the existing order, but they do take initiatives in ways that create new institutions, that sort of changes the state of play, it changes the role of certain actors. And insofar as you accept that definition of revisionism, I will say they're both revisionist and they're trying to upgrade the existing order to their benefit. The US is changing the role in the region. Someone said that. I think it's true to say that the U.S. responds to the concerns of allies, and it doesn't intend in that response to be destabilizing. However, the fundamental differences of interest between the U.S. and China does engender instability, even if none of the parties wanted that. So in that sense, it ends up being destabilizing, even if it wasn't intended. And I do think the South China Sea is a key area for U.S.-China working out the future regional order or key aspects of it. And in that sense, these powers are significant actors in the South China Sea. Thank you.
I'm not a part of the government. I can always have the liberty to speak for myself. I want to have fairness and equality. So no country would have any superiority, would go with precedence over other country because it's bigger. We are all equal vis-a-vis international law, UN Charter, UNCLOS, etc. For UN Charter, then that settles sovereignty. Philippines until 1990s did not think Scarborough Shoal a part of it. It has its constitution defining its westmost territory, ending with Luzon. Scarborough is 130 nautical miles west of Luzon. Only UNCLOS brings this area to Philippines EEZ. But UNCLOS does not bring any non-Philippine territory inside its EEZ as Philippines territory. That's how US may not feel a reason to have legitimacy to defend the Philippines, because the Philippines until 20 years ago did not say it's a part of Philippines. And the Republic of China started this for 50 years at least, and will continue. So only one country claimed. Philippines did not claim. Vietnam did not claim Scarborough. Why China did not deserve it? So per UN Charter and UNCLOS, we are entitled, no dispute. But why arrest the Chinese fishermen in the water nearby? And that kind of low tide elevation may be entitled to sovereign water. So if our fishermen were arrested in the territorial water area, it violates UN Charter. But that place may not have EEZ. So if they arrest our fishermen beyond the territorial water, and they may have a reason. That's why we need to talk. How the exact story is, why they have a reason or we have. So I think China wants to have bilateral talk with Philippines in order to listen to their story and to respect their rights. But the rights they have not claimed for 50 years, we should not easily be deprived of. Simply they negated their early commitment. So that's how multilateral talk would not resolve this kind of bilateral story. We insist to talk rather than to go to court. Go to court, either side can lose a lot. We go to ICJ, they may lose territory, but we lose more water. And they go to International Tribunal, but without settling the sovereignty of the rock, how you can say that we are not entitled to any water inside? Certainly we may not entitled to the holistic approach that for all overlapped water we are entitled. Personally, I have difficulty with this. So I will need to speak to my government. We may have room to improve, but I hope our Philippine friend also has room to improve. And that same rationale may also apply to the problem between China and Vietnam.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, Captain.
just regarding to the practical functions and roles of the middle powers. From my personal perspective, only middle powers in the region can teach China and United States to play more responsible role, because they need more partners and even alliance to cooperate with them on their own side. South Korea already initiated 2 important middle power initiatives, such as MICA, Mexico, Indonesia, Korea, and Australia coordination, and then NAPSI, Northeast Peace Cooperation Initiative. So such a mechanism initiated by South Korean government, which is composed of regional middle powers, can teach China, please stop doing wrong things. Please not to play the ambiguity of the UNCLOS to legitimize your the sovereignty or historical right in the South China Sea. And at the time, we can ask to United States, please do more active role. Please not to see the side to observing what happened in the South China Sea. I mean, I give you one indication. There are huge articles and the reports with regarding to South China's land reclamation work since September 2013. But I didn't see any practical actions from the United States. And then suddenly we have the actions from the United States say freedom of navigation operation in the South China Sea. And that set more fears on the issue of South China Sea. So I think this is the right time to great power should ask what they will do for the middle powers in the region in order to seek to the more peaceful and more harmonious solutions. Thank you.
Thank you, Captain. I apologize for anyone who have no opportunity to raise your comment or question, but time is up. So I would like you to raise your comment and question again, because in the next 3 sections we have a little bit the same issue, the same problem. Okay. So please join me to thank all the speakers and discussion of this section. Yeah. So lunch is waiting for you. Please enjoy.